We don't have a large crowd, but we're thankful that you three are all here, and it looks like we have one visitor online. So our goal today is to talk about our second version of the NMV budget, and one of our other goals is we hope that we can explain to you what our narrative here, our reality here, is here in FNESU compared to the rest of the state, because there's definitely some things that are being said in the media around school spending across the state that are not really true for us here in FNESU. So those are two of our goals for tonight, and we want to make sure that if you have any questions about the budget, that we get those answered before you leave here tonight. So we're going to jump right in. Morgan and I are going to go back and forth in the presentation. We've got two board members online. Three board members online, and we have Arlene here, and we have one of our administrators, Gavin. So we'll start off with just the reality of what's happened to school budgets in Vermont. So there were 31 school budgets that were defeated in Vermont this year, definitely unprecedented. 14 school budgets are regularly voted after town meeting day. Some of those have been voted on. There are still some that have not yet been voted on. There was a provision in the law that we're going to talk about in a little bit that allowed communities to delay their first budget vote and re-look at it and then rewarn a new budget. 8 school budgets across the state, 8 school districts decided to delay across the state.
What's the total number that are being voted on? Like 31 out of how many?
120-ish. Yeah, it's not. It's hard. We have about. It's hard to like determine how many districts there are, because we know we have 57 superintendents, but some superintendents like me have multiple districts. So we believe there's right around 120 from what we've seen. So I'll talk a little bit about the town meeting day results. So in NMV, it was a relatively close margin. It was 52.3 to 47.7. So it was a 49 vote margin between the yeses and the nos.
And this shows some of the voting history for NMV's budget votes. So in 2019, for fiscal year 2020, it's the first year that we voted as a unified system. And you can see that the percent yes has been ranging between about 55% to 75%, pretty solid wins each year. And certainly in the last 4 years, the number of yes votes has been pretty consistent, and it's really been the number of no votes that's varied from year to year, for what that's worth.
So we took a look at voter turnout in each of our 4 communities, and that is, it doesn't feel like many voters came out, but it actually is higher than what it typically is, because it was a primary. So that's how many people turned out in each of our communities.
And when we start the budget process with the boards, we first walk them through this, which is a history and projection in terms of the enrollment for the 4 schools in NMV. So the 5 years on the left side are actual kids that we count on October 1st, and then the 5 years on the right side are the projections of where we think those school populations are going. So on this, you can see that over the next 5 years, we anticipate that Berkshire, Montgomery, and Bakersfield are all going to have relatively steady population trends, and we are still anticipating a pretty dramatic increase in Sheldon Elementary over those next 5 years. It's also important to put out on the table that this story of relatively flat enrollment is very different than the rest of the state, especially in southeastern Vermont. They're seeing pretty steep declines still, and so us holding our own, if you will, is sort of bucking the statewide trend. So I was in a testimony in the House yesterday, or in a meeting, and somebody had mentioned that a legislator had mentioned that they get emails with 2-paragraph emails. First paragraph says our taxes are too high, and the second paragraph says don't close our school of 40 kids, and they struggle to reconcile that. One of the things that we struggle to reconcile with these meetings in terms of educating folks on the budget is half the people say that we go too deep into how tax rates are set, and half the people say we don't make it simple enough for them. So the top line is as simple as it gets in terms of setting tax rates in Vermont. We take the money we need, we divide it by the number of kids, we divide it by the yield, which is a number that the legislature sets, and that gets to a tax rate. The money we need is what's called education spending, and so it's the budget that you all eventually adopt, that the board warns, less any revenue that we think we're going to get. And so that's the amount of money we need from the state to support that passed budget. The number of students is a weighted 2-year average of kids. And so this is calculated by the state, but they look at the actual kids who've shown up in the last 2 years. They assign different weights based on different factors. So we know that kids who don't hear English at home cost more than other kids to educate, so we get to count them for more. We get to count kids in poverty for more. We get to count, because of the sparsity, the rural nature of our area, we get to count more kids because of that. That's divided by the yield. Again, this is a number that the legislature comes up with. It's calculated based on the budgets that pass, and it's designed so that this property tax scheme will raise enough money to support those budgets.
So in the year that we're in right now, that question you had about 120 systems, each of the lines here represents a different system in the state of Vermont. So at the very top, that represents the highest spending system, which is right around 18,000. And at the very bottom, it's the lowest spending system that's around 8,000. So this is, again, for this school year. And in this school year, we have, I'm just going to talk you through what you see there. The red lines reflect other systems in Franklin County. The first black line represents the Franklin County average per pupil spending. The second black line represents the statewide average per pupil spending. And then go down towards the bottom, that first blue line that you see is the Enosburg-Richford Unified Union School District spending per pupil. And then below that is the NMV per pupil spending. So in this current year, our spending was the 12th and 18th lowest in the state of Vermont per pupil.
And how will those change? How will sort of our ranking on that list change given the
Let me show you on the next slide.
I'll hold that.
So this on the left is what I just showed you, but it's blown up to represent the bottom 20 districts in the state. So you see where we are, Enosburg-Richford at 18th and NMV at 12th, lowest spending in the state. Over on the right-hand side, that's where everybody is right now, to the best of what we can calculate with the information that Morgan's been able to get out of the agency. Green represents past budgets, red represents failed budgets, and black represents a district that has not yet voted on their budget. So when we, if both of our budgets had passed, we would have dropped to 9th and 10th lowest spending in the state. So now with the rewarn of our budget, we are, Enosburg-Richford has dropped to 8th and NMV has dropped to 9th lowest spending. But we think we might have another district that we just got data from another district that might have dropped right below ER.
Yep, there were a couple of districts that have failed budgets recently and have rewarned, and so there may be somebody who's dropped below us.
So the reality is we're bottom 9 or 10 in the state.
And so that even includes the extra that the state is giving us based on poverty, rural.
Both of those data sets include that.
Yeah.
Yep.
So what's interesting about that data on the right-hand side is if you think about us being 9th and 10th lowest spending, there are 4 systems that are below us. Let me just look at my notes here so I can get it right. Ira, Holland, Stratton, Morgan. Ira, Holland, Stratton, and Morgan. They're all lower spending than we are, but none of them operate schools. So we're really, if you think about it, fifth and sixth lowest spending, or fourth and fifth lowest spending when you look at it in that terms of the schools of the systems who operate schools.
So I'll try to speed through this because I know some of you have probably heard this 8 times by now. Act 127 is a bill that was passed and has gotten a lot of press this year. In Vermont, we've got a constitutional guarantee for equal access to funding, and the way the state guarantees that is through those weighted pupils that they had before Act 127, but they changed under Act 127. It was originally put in place in about 2000 after the Brigham court case using Act 60, and it recognized that what we just talked about, that some kids cost more to educate than others. But when they passed that law, they didn't really have any data, or they didn't go looking for data. So they said, yeah, kids who live in poverty probably cost more, but we don't really know how much more, so we're going to call it 20% more. Act 127 was designed to really dig into the data on that and correct those weights. So we saw that when it was passed, kids in poverty started counting more. English language learners started counting more. They added those categories for kids who are in a sparsely populated area because they know it costs more to transport them or to run smaller schools. So although the weights have changed, the concept hasn't. They're just trying to equalize the difficulty in educating kids from an area like ours versus an area in Chittenden County, let's say. When they put that in place, they knew that districts like ours that were going to do better under this new law were going to have a decision on whether they could invest that money in kids or use that to just drive down their tax rates. And the law is pretty clear that they wanted those investments going to supporting those kids. Conversely, towns that were going to see a drop in the number of kids they had because of those weights were given a 5-year glide path. They wanted those towns, those districts to have time to right-size their staffing if that's what needed to be done. And so the path that they gave them was a cap to the increase of their tax rate. They said that in those towns, actually for any town in Vermont, your tax rate before the CLA could not go up more than 5%. And that becomes relevant a little bit later. And again, we talked about the dollar yield, and that was kind of the mechanism that the legislature uses to set those tax rates. And so as education spending declines anywhere in the state, the yield will go up and everyone's taxes go down. As the dollar yield increases, the tax rate drops, as I said. And then there's this concept of a tax floor. So no matter where your budget is, you are going to have at least a $1 tax rate. And that was put in place primarily for places like Buell's Gore and Avery's Gore. They might not have any students in a given year, so not have any education budget. But there's property there, and we have a statewide tax system, and so we need to figure out a way to tax those communities. So this graph is a little bit busy, but in it you'll see at the bottom, we're starting basically at the beginning of 2024 and going through about mid-February in terms of the time. That yellow line is the estimated yield that the legislature will set in May or June. You can see it bumps around a lot. The blue line is the NMV tax rate. You can see it moves opposite of the yield. So as the yield drops, the tax rate goes up. That flat red line is the current year tax rate, which is at $1.15. And so at the beginning of January 3rd, all the way over to the left, this board signed off on their first budgets. And based on the data we had that day, we thought that was going to be a $1.14 tax rate. So they approved the budget thinking they would cut the taxes by a penny in addition to that increased spending that we have under Act 127. We go about a week out, the legislature makes some adjustments to their predictions, the yield drops a little bit, the projection of the tax rate is now almost $1.18. And that's the point where we send out the town books to folks. So We, the board was hoping for a tax cut, few cents higher. We send that information out. We go another couple weeks out. The legislature changes their calculation again. It now looks like it's $1.12. We say, okay, we're not going to rewarn anything. We're not going to change the books, but we'll talk to folks about that $1.12 when we have them at meetings like this.
We did put in some of the annual reports in a couple of places that it was hard to write about it this year because there was so much flux in all of this. So we said this is what we know right now as we're writing this, and it will be different by the time we get to town meeting.
So if you go back to like November, December, even October, several of us were looking at that 5% cap and realizing that there were places in the state where boards would be looking at that and saying, there's nothing we can do to cut our budget to get below that 5% increase. And we can actually add whatever we want to our budget, and it's not going to go up higher than that 5% increase. So we started hearing about towns that were saying, we haven't been able to get a bond passed to fix the roof on our school, so we're going to put the $6 million in our budget, we're going to get the roof done, and it's not going to hurt our taxpayers at all. We're going to put $5 million into a capital reserve fund because we can, and we're not paying for it, and we're going to use that to fix the next school's roof 3 years down the road. The problem with that is that we are a statewide system, and so somebody has to pay for those costs. If it's not those towns where the money's being spent, it's going to go out through that yield to the rest of us. So the Agency of Education and the legislature sort of did a deeper dive into where budgets were being warned and what those actual costs were. And you can see when they did that on January 25th-ish, they put out a new yield number, which completely tanked. And so the budget that we had warned in January, there's no changes to what our spending plan was, would have cost the taxpayers $1.52. And that was because we were now paying for all of those, all of that excess spending in other towns. The legislature acted surprisingly quickly and definitively, and they changed that transition mechanism. So now instead of having a 5% cap, we're going to give you X cents off your tax rate. So we're still recognizing that those districts need some time to write their budgets, but they don't have a blank check for spending. If they're going to add money to their budget at some level, they're going to pay for it. And so when they did that and remodeled it, they assumed those towns were going to keep their spending in, but it wasn't going to go out to all of us. That yield rate shot back up to the highest number it had been, and we were now looking at $1.10 tax rate, probably about a nickel lower than what we are paying this year. Since then, and I have not charted this out any farther than February, they have done some other data collections. They know some budgets have gone down and failed, and money is coming out of them. And each time those budgets get cut, it helps that yield, it drives that yield up, and it drives down our proposed tax rate. So we are now, because of that, and because of the changes in the budget we made, we're at about $1.05 in terms of what we're predicting. So that's pretty dense. Is there any questions on that? I know two of you could probably talk through this slide by now.
I guess can you hit on how we have that dollar floor?
Yeah, we'll get to that next, I think. So this is the projected tax rate for NMV starting from FY20, that first year that we were a unified system. It kind of drifted up a little bit for the first 2 years, and then for the next 2 years it dropped pretty precipitously. And this is largely because of the hot real estate market. The statewide grand list is going up pretty dramatically, and so you have to raise less money or a lower tax rate against that. You now see in FY25 that's at about $1.05, and that's where we anticipate things are going. Again, we're guessing at where the legislature is going to end. But at that bottom of the chart, you see a $1 rate point, and you see in the last 3 years, we're kind of screaming towards it. Once you cross that dollar threshold, your tax rate doesn't go down any farther. It's always going to sit at $1. And so if we cut $1 million out of our budget below that threshold, it's $1 million we're not spending, but it's still money that we're raising here and we're sending into the ed fund, and that's going out to that statewide system. So it's now, instead of helping us, it's helping everyone.
So is it not so much that we're raising it and sending it out, but would that just be less that we would be getting from the state? Is that another way of looking at it?
It's not less than we'd be getting from the state because, well, if we cut $1 million out of our budget, then we're not getting that $1 million from the state. But it's not helping the tax rate at all at that point. And so we can go as far down below that as we want to, and it's still going to be $1 because it would be treating us like one of those gores that might not have any kids in a year, and they still get a $1 rate.
So the simplest way to look at it is we would be cutting resources from our schools without any added tax benefit for our taxpayers. So the dollar floor was a heavy part of the conversation that the board members had when they revisited what this budget should be, because we still have, I think we still are around, I actually don't know the number, I think high 20s maybe that still haven't passed, or 30s.
Yeah.
There's still quite a few budgets that haven't passed. Some have already gone down a second time. So every time more money comes out, that's gonna drive that yield up and our tax rate down further. So the board was really thoughtful about, let's cut something, but we wanna be careful not to get us to that floor, because it just doesn't make sense in a system that has been historically underfunded to take more resources away from our kids and not benefit our taxpayers. So that floor is a big piece.
Do you want me to go back?
You mentioned the yield. I believe, 5 out of 6 budgets have failed the revotes. And is that enough to increase that yield theoretically, or do we need to hit a tipping point, maybe 10 or 12?
It depends. So when Essex Westford, which is one of the 3 biggest budgets in the state, when they fail, there's potentially a lot of capacity there for them to cut costs. One of the district on the bottom on that big chart is Holland, and they only tuition kids out and their budget failed, so like they can't cut anything. They're just gonna have to keep going back with a similar budget. So it kind of depends on who's are failing. South Burlington, yeah, big budget, they could potentially take some money out.
I mean, the theory is, I think it used to be more predictable, like for every however many hundreds of thousands that comes out, you could expect the yield to go down by this much. And we've had conversations with the financial experts at the state level, and it's so volatile this year that they don't feel comfortable predicting what that's going to be. So they just are telling us, wait for the ed fund outlook, But when we had to warn this budget, do you want to talk about the decisions around the yield projection that we have?
I can.
Did they set it this week?
They won't set it until probably May. They will put a placeholder number in on, I think, Tuesday is what I'm
They are working on the
hearing.
yield bill, though. That might be what you heard.
Yeah.
They're working on the yield bill, but it'll be way at the end, because they want as much of this information as they can before they set that final number.
And I think you're right with South Burlington and Essex Westford. My guess is they're going to wait until those budgets are rewarned at least.
In Champlain Valley.
In Champlain Valley, so they can incorporate that.
There are actually several, I'm looking at the list right now, quite a lot of budgets vote next week on April 16th. We've got Springfield, I don't know what Payne Mountain is, but Milton, Lamoille North, Fairfax, Elmore, Champlain Valley.
So up until this point, we've been talking about the district-wide tax rate, and that gets the common level of appraisal applied to it before you get that rate on your tax bill. And so what the common level of appraisal is attempting to do is to equalize the difference in one town's grand list versus another. So maybe Montgomery reappraised 5 years ago, and their grand list is relatively accurate compared to Berkshire's, who hasn't reappraised in 10 years. And so what it does is it's saying, the calculation is that a CLA of 80% is saying that a $100,000 house is actually worth $125,000 if you put it on the market and sold it. At a CLA above 100%, it says that the fair market value is lower. All of our CLAs in this district are all relatively close, so there's not a lot of difference from one town to town. But in Enosburg, Richford, for example, Richford just had a reappraisal, and so those numbers are pretty dramatically different. The tax rate that we've been talking about so far gets divided by the CLA to get the local tax rate, and then statewide, for the most part, everyone's CLAs are falling because there's been such a boom on purchases, specifically around second homes. A lot of second homes going for a lot more than they've been valued for. And so this chart shows the black line, which is that district level rate, and above that are the 4 town rates. So that is showing the impact of the CLA. So you can see, even though the district tax rate has been dropping for the last 3 years, we had a drop in the first year, and then those local rates have started going up. And that is because we are so far off of the grand lists that we have in our towns. We know that one of the towns, I think it might be Enosburg, has contracted with someone to do their reappraisal, and I don't think they're starting for another 3 years because they're so backed up, and it'll be 2 years of data collection before they get
I'm gonna
that.
say the number before it falls out of my head. 42. There's still 42 budgets out there that have not been approved yet. Not necessarily failed. Some of them just haven't done their first vote yet, but 42 total.
So third.
Yep, still third. So the calculation behind the CLA is really wonky and difficult to explain, but we have up here trying to show what it does in terms of tax impact. So Berkshire is down at the bottom left quadrant, and what we've done is we've shown what the impact is for a house that's assessed at either 100,000, 200,000, or 300,000. Berkshire's CLA is just under 78%, and so that $100,000 house, the state is saying has a fair market value of about 129,000. On the budget that we are living in right now, FY24, their tax bill on that $100,000 house was $1,336. On the budget that we've just warned, with the assumptions we're making on the yield, that $100,000 listed house would have to pay $1,363, or an increase of $27 year over year. You can see up there, and we are going to be sharing this on our website, so you can look at it later. I do want to point out on this side that you'll see over in Sheldon in the bottom right, the tax bill with this version 2 budget and the assumptions we make is actually going to drop for their town. And that's because I think what's going on is that this year their CLA did not drop as much, and they had seen some pretty significant drops a couple years before. So I think the market just hit them earlier than it hit our other 3 towns.
So the decisions that the staff had to make was they really wanted to prioritize existing staff and student programming. So one of the things they had in the budget was a shared school resource officer for the 4 schools, and that was the position that they chose to pull out of the budget for this next year. So what we do know is we're hoping this is the last budget that we have to put out there. If it's not, if it's defeated, then they are going to have to go into positions that haven't yet been filled and try to figure out, what are they going to look at there, and is there programming that we have to look at. So those were 2 things that they really tried to avoid.
So I talked about how everything that we spend on education in Vermont is going through what's called the Education Fund, and that's made up of roughly a quarter in residential property tax, 39% is non-residential property tax. So that would be second homeowners, businesses, rental properties primarily. And then the rest comes from other sources, which is primarily sales tax, There's a little bit of rooms and meals tax that goes into that. Lottery proceeds, some money from Medicaid, and then a couple other smaller streams of money that go in there. And again, we'll talk about this on the next slide, but all of the money that's raised anywhere technically is going into that state bucket and then coming back out to us based on the budgets that we pass. And then in NMV, what we did, we had someone from another town wanted to see this, and so we're looking at this current year budget. If you look at the bottom of that list of numbers, the educational spending, so that money that we are collecting from the state ed fund is just under 19 million. And you can see how much is raised out of these different pockets. So starting at the top, $845,000 comes from residential tax raised in Bakersfield, and this is after all those income sensitivity calculations are included. So you can kind of walk down through the list there. You can see it on the pie chart, and so on the pie chart starting at noon and working around, the dark orange slice is Bakersfield, the dark blue slice is Berkshire, dark green slice is Montgomery, the dark purple slice is Sheldon, and then there's this dark red slice, and that is money that's raised on residential tax, on the residential tax base in other towns that comes to us through that ed fund. So there's a concept, certainly it exists to this day in Montgomery, that somehow we're raising more money in our town than we're spending. And what this is kind of attempting to show is that, in fact, in terms of residential tax rate, we're getting $750,000 from our neighbors out of district, largely in those property wealthy towns that maybe don't have a lot of students. Similar with non-residential tax rate working around the wheel, that dark pink at about 6 o'clock is the amount of non-residential tax that's raised somewhere else in the state and comes to us to support our budget. And then finally, that last chunk of the pie, roughly a third, is those consumption taxes that are raised everywhere. So that's the sales tax and the rooms and meals tax and the lottery proceeds. We've talked about this generally in other budget meetings, so I won't spend a lot of time. This is here to show the board and show the voters big picture what we spend money on. So everything in that first half, all that's in red, is what we're spending on our own people in these schools. The biggest slice of the pie on the blue side are tuition payments. So it's primarily high school tuition. There's some pre-K tuition payments that are in there. And then other than that, relatively small slices. Other services is mostly the things that we spend at the supervisory union level. So that's going to be your special educators, it's going to be your food service, and your transportation in terms of the three big cost centers. We do this primarily to focus people on that green slice of the pie, which is supplies and utilities. So out of that are the paper, pencils, crayons, Chromebooks that we buy, but it's also going to be things like your electric bill and your fuel bill. And so folks, as we go through this budget process, we certainly hear a lot, if you only spent less money on photocopying, our budget would be a lot lower. And really, taking away the tuition payments, which you don't have any control over, our budget is our people.
I just want to add one thing about the tuition payments. On this side, on the NMV side, because you're tuitioning towns, there are years where we see big shifts in those tuition bills, and this happens to be one of those years. So we have a really small senior class graduating combined between all the schools that we send tuition to, in a really large collective group of 8th graders. So that increases in tuition costs plus the additional students that we're sending that's almost $1 million in this budget in terms of what we added in spending. So I think that's important to understand that definitely has a strong impact on the budget.
And then briefly, this is looking at that same budget just based on what we do. And so the green 2/3 is what we think of as kind of traditional instruction. It's either our teachers in front of our kids, or those high school teachers in front of our high school kids, wherever they may end up. Working around the blue section of the pie, student support, that first wedge is primarily your guidance counselors and your nurses. Instructional support, the next one, would be professional development for teachers, technology, and then the big chunk of it is librarians. General administration is some board level costs and some district level insurance costs. School administration, primarily the principal's office, so principal, vice principals, their admin assistants, and then some other costs that they spend out of their office. Central services, the roughly 10% up there at about 10 o'clock. We will go into this in a little more detail later, but again, this is the assessment that is paid out to the supervisory union, and so that's your special educators, food service, and transportation, along with the cost of keeping us around. The dark blue line, buildings and grounds, this is what it is costing you to keep your 4 buildings up and running. And then there is debt service, that small red slice of the pie, or the bond payments that we have on our buildings remaining.
One of the questions that came up when we did the community survey was that there doesn't appear to be an understanding of what functions our central office staff have. And one of the questions was centered on what's required under statute, because there have been shifts. So I pulled up our green law book and pulled out one of the statutes that came into play probably about a decade ago. And this was when we shifted. It used to be, I think this shifted while I was a principal here at Berkshire, and student transportation used to be in the Berkshire budget. And at that time, all of that had to be under one contract at the SU level. The same goes for special education. So all of our special educators went over to that SU budget. We have also pushed over any staff that are like behavior technicians. Those are now all in the SU budget. But these are some of the functions that are required by law to be organized at the central office level. So all curriculum development, implementation, the organization of the educational assessment component has to come out of there, all of the professional development for all categories of staff across the board, special ed, transportation, all of the financial management has to come out of our office, everything that falls under the realm of policy development and all coordination of any sort of student services, the data management and reporting and community engagement. So these are all functions that fall under supervisory union within that statute. There's another piece that was added around the same time that they started talking about Act 127, Act 173 came into play. And can you shift down a slide, Courtney, please? So Act 173, no worries, thank you for coming. These are just some of the things that we've been working on in FNESU that are connected to 173. So our work around building multi-tiered systems of supports for our students, the work we've done to universally design our learning for all of our students. There are requirements in there around data, student IEPs, professional development, engagement, transition planning. That's one of the things we have to do related to students with disabilities, transitioning from like early ed programs into elementary into high school, and high school into adult services. Equity and inclusion, focusing on all aspects of education, ensuring that everyone has access to high quality resources and opportunities for success. All collaboration with external agencies and compliance with other state and federal laws.
So this is something that we've started sharing with the boards, all 3 of our boards this year, and so we have it here. What I've done in this slide is I've taken the most recent proposed supervisory union budget, Enosburg-Richford budget, and NMV budget, pushed them all together, and then took out some of the duplication. So the few $1,000,000 that you send to Enosburg-Richford to educate high school kids has been pulled out of that. And then it's just, again, showing kind of big picture where we spend our money. So that first blue section on the right are teachers in front of kids, and then working our way around the wheel. At the bottom in red is special educators in front of kids. We've got vocational instruction. There's a few tiny lines for athletics and co-curricular. Again, student support, which is guidance counselors primarily, and nurses. Instructional support, again, librarians, some technology, and professional development for teachers. General administration, that thin yellow line, is again those board level costs. So it would be board of directors, it would be district-wide insurance, what we spend on in terms of lawyers' fees, and then the kind of traditional central office folks, the people on my right and my left. School administration is primarily the principals now across those 9 buildings, and their support staff and some costs in there. Central services, the orange line, is primarily financial support, HR support, and then district-wide technology that we do, so the part of the budget that I come in on. Buildings and grounds, roughly 10% is what we spend to take care of those 9 buildings that we have. We've split out then transportation and food service as well, because they're relatively significant cost centers. And then on the next slide here, this is just the supervisory union budget, but we're attempting here to pull out where we are spending that money. So you can see all that little lines, if you add them all together, that's primarily what we're spending on special ed. And for the most part, we know that teacher X is going to be in Berkshire next year, so we can say, yeah, this part of the budget belongs to Berkshire. Moving around the wheel, the big green section is food service, which we don't try to split out by school, and transportation, getting kids to and from school, which we also don't try to split out by school. And then that pink third of the pie are costs that either we have not yet been able to split out, or they truly shouldn't be split out. So we have our English language learner teachers in there, because sitting here in December when we set this budget the first time, we don't know where they're going to be placed in next December, because we don't know where the need's going to be. OT and PT services are in there. Our instructional coaches are in there, because we don't know where we're going to have new teachers that need that support. And then the traditional things that we don't split out by school, like the 3 of us. And then the last 2, the small pieces up there, are the costs for those 2 alternative programs. So we've broken them out, but they're not really school specific.
So we have, Morgan and I have been also looking at how do we communicate differently between the first budget and this budget. And so we've changed some of the ways we're trying to get things out in different locations. We have actually been doing a little bit of a road show, and we've gone to every one of our schools to speak directly to staff members, and there's a lot of confusion around school budgets right now. And that narrative that people are hearing at the state, once you hear something like this at the meeting, I hope that it helps people. Our experience has been, it helps people to understand we're in a different circumstance than much of that statewide narrative is. So this is something that we've just talked to people about. Thank you for attending the meeting. It's really helpful for voters to be informed as they go out to the poll. We hope that we've given you information to help you understand the difference between FNESU and the statewide narrative. We hope that you will take the time to vote. The absentee ballots are available now, so people can go pick those up. You can actually vote right there, or you can take it home and mail it back. We ask that if you're talking to other people about the budget, that you encourage them to either watch one of these sessions, because we record them and we post them all online, or encourage them to participate in other meetings. This is our first informational meeting for budget round 2 for NMV, and we have 3 more coming up.
And this will be, that'll be the article that you'll see on the ballot. that's the only thing that we're voting on in round 2.
The other informational meetings that are coming up are Monday, sorry, at 6:30 in Sheldon, Wednesday, the 24th at 6:30 in Bakersfield, and Monday, the 29th, so the night before, 6:30 at Montgomery. So please encourage others to come out and learn about our budget.
Joe, was that a question?
I believe in July, the universal child care payroll tax kicks in.
Yeah.
Schools schools as employers, are they subjected to that
Yep.
that payroll tax also?
Yep.
Is that factored into this year's budget going forward?
Yeah. It's, yeah, I think on a district by district basis, it's not a huge hit, but yeah, statewide, again, most of our expenses are in people.
I guess what that's an additional 120, 130 that you want to raise.
I think so, yeah. Yeah, and they put it in there so that, in theory, employers could share some of that with employees, but that really only works if you're in a non-union environment because you have to open that up in negotiation.
The last thing we just want to say is about our polling locations. There is a slight change from last time in Sheldon. So in Bakersfield, the polling location is at the town hall and they're open from 10 until 7 on April 30th. In Berkshire, it is at the town office. They're open from 10 until 7. In Montgomery, it's at the town hall, and that is from 10 until 7. In Sheldon, it is shifted to the town offices, and they're actually open from 7 to 7 in Sheldon. The other thing that last time I had a couple people that said, oh, I forgot to register to vote, so I couldn't vote. That's another piece, if people are watching this, I want them to understand is you can actually register to vote when you go to vote. You can do same day registration in Vermont. So, do any of you have questions? I know we have public online. Are there any questions online, Courtney?
I don't see any in the chat.
So if there's anyone online that has a question, feel free to either unmute and ask it or write it in the chat. Arlene or board members, does anybody have anything they'd like to say?
I'm gonna stop my share so you can see.
This is Mary. Sorry I wasn't able to be there in person. I just wanted to kind of thank everyone who attended and thank you Morgan and Lynn and Courtney too for putting together the updated presentation. It's really, the information is super helpful, very clear, and I'm just hoping that people who are there in person and online will kind of speak with their community members and really encourage us and our communities to come together in support of what's a very thoughtful budget and a budget that we need in order to keep offering the opportunities that we do to our communities. So thank you.
Thanks, Mary. I'm noticing Emily just came back on. Emily, did you have any questions?
Well, yeah, sorry I had to miss that. I had
That's
an appointment pending here. One question I had was how many students were taking advantage of the virtual Pathways Academy that were K-6?
I think it was around 10, yeah.
Okay, that was just a curiosity. Not sure what I missed in the meantime, but feel free to keep going. That was one of my primary questions.
I'm wondering.
And I believe, Lynn, I was just gonna say, I had asked the same question as Emily, and I believe it was 10, and that is, again, SU-wide, so all 6 schools, K through 6, so also including ER plus the NMV schools.
And I'm assuming that you're asking that because that is one thing that we did cut out of the FNESU budget.
Yep, I was just curious how many families that affected, how many
Yeah.
students. It was, that's one that I'm okay with. I would rather I'm okay with all the budget cuts that got made. I would just like it all to go back to the teachers. And I think that your point about a statewide teacher contract is so important.
We would love to see that at some point. It would be hugely beneficial for our students and our schools to have greater stability in terms of, a lot of people leave because of the compensation, and our boards have been very thoughtful over the years and have really invested in the last several in increasing teacher compensation. The reality is as you can see by where we fall on that list, it's very easy for systems that are spending maybe $4,000 more per student to match wherever we go. And so we're constantly in a chase.
Jared.
I guess, based on current projected yield, what can voters expect for a potential tax increase percentage-wise for this year? We're hearing numbers from 18% last night on the news, we've heard 14%, 20%. What can voters in this district expect for a percentage increase based on what we know now?
So I don't know if you want to go back to that tax rate slide.
Percentage-wise?
Yeah, well, it's different town by town, because as I showed you, Sheldon's actually going to see a decrease. So we can pull that up and do the math quickly for you all. So in Berkshire, it's about a 2% increase.
2% in last year's budget?
Yep.
That's what we can see the difference in our tax bill.
Yep. That's that $27 per 100,000.
How many $100,000 homes are there?
What's that?
How many people are $100,000?
Not anymore.
But a lot of them are still 100,000 on the grand list. So, which is the problem.
Any other questions? Thank you, everyone, for coming out. We appreciate it. And again, feel free, if you wanted to come again, these are open to members, and any community can come to any of the informational sessions. So, thank you.